I'm announcing that the United States will be sending 31 Abrams tanks to Ukraine.
As Ukraine pleads for more heavy weapons, the U.S. considers the scope of its military assistance amid growing concerns of a new escalation in the conflict. Hello and welcome to Inside America with me, Ghida Fakhry. President Biden's announcement last week to send 31 Abrams tanks to Ukraine, reversing his administration's earlier decision not to supply Kiev with one of its most advanced offensive weapons used in ground combat, was met with renewed requests by President Zelensky for fighter jets and long-range missiles.
Важливо, ми маємо розширювати і нашу співпрацю в артилерії, ми маємо вийти на постачання літаків для України. І це мрія, і це задача. Важливе завдання для всіх нас.
Zelensky also highlighted the importance of the, quote, speed and volume of tanks delivered to Ukraine, with Biden acknowledging that delivering these tanks to the battlefield is, quote, going to take time, with estimates that it could take several months, August at the earliest. But can 31 Abrams and other main battle tanks turn the tide of the war? Joining me now to discuss this and the wider Ukraine-Russia conflict is former U.S. Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, who served under President Obama from 2013 to 2015. He was also a Republican senator. Secretary Hagel, thanks so much for being with me. When you were Secretary of Defense back in 2013-2015 under President Obama, Russia annexed Crimea, essentially without a shot being fired. You have said this about the Ukrainian army, quote, that it was so bad it hadn't been trained, that Ukrainian governments have been pretty corrupt since independence, that you couldn't give them the kind of weapons that they wanted, they couldn't use them, they probably would leave them on the battlefield. Things have obviously changed, but have they changed fundamentally when you look at the state in which the Ukrainian army is today?
Well, I think they have changed dramatically and fundamentally. You've got a whole fundamentally different makeup of the government, of the efforts to clean up their government, of the training of the troops. Western nations and the United States has been in late 2014 training the Ukrainians. So it's just fundamentally different, their abilities, and especially their ability to handle sophisticated weaponry that we just couldn't give them in 2014 because they couldn't handle it. The discipline.
And at the time, Secretary Hagel, it wasn't just that you were worried about them not being able to handle these weapons. You were concerned that U.S. arms could end up with the enemy. Worse, perhaps, they could end up with non-state actors, couldn't they? I mean, there are reports of Western-supplied weapons ending up not in the Ukraine theater, but elsewhere.
Well, that was a major consideration, and it was a big concern. It's a totally different situation today, as I've already said. And the Ukrainian army, the armed forces, their leadership, starting with the president on down, their generals, their field commanders, it's a totally different force 10 years later. So they can handle these weapons. And with the Western help that we've had in there year after year over the last 10 years to help train them, is really made a difference. But again, I say it's important here to recognize that I think one of the fundamental mistakes Mr. Putin made was to believe that he could take the government down in less than 30 days in Ukraine. Another fundamental mistake that he made was not understanding how the Ukrainians would fight for their country. And probably as big a misunderstanding and misconception that he had was that the West would hold together. NATO would hold together. The 30 nations of NATO would stay together. And they pretty much have. And as they've increased the quality of armaments in there. So these were major misjudgments that Putin made. But
has the West, Secretary Hagel, Has the West, though, also made significant misjudgments and miscalculations? I mean, we know the US resisted for almost a year Ukraine's repeated pleas for heavy arms. Now it's decided to supply 31 Abrams tanks and allow its NATO partners to provide other main battle tanks as well. It's a major political decision, isn't it? A major escalation.
That's right. And I was supportive of giving Ukrainians the tanks many months ago and more sophisticated weapons, because what you've got to look at here is not just what's going on today in the battlefield, but you've got to project ahead. How does this end? When does it end? Where does it end? And that's where you've got to be. And there's no way that the Russians, as they have released inmates out of their prisons, tens of thousands, and they're just conscripting 200,000 more to put into Ukraine. There's no way the Russians are going to pull back here. They're going to keep, just as they always have done in every war, just keep pushing men into the battle. We should have understood that better. And we should have been thinking about more sophisticated weaponry. Now, I get this. You've got to understand and see, in fact, can the Ukrainians handle this? And they've proven that they can. Therefore, the more sophisticated weaponry and specifically the tanks are now forthcoming. But I think we could have done that before.
You say you could have done that before, but is it a wise decision to do it now? And is it essentially a political stunt? Because it is going to take months to have the Abrams tanks on the front lines, isn't it? Is it a wise decision if the aim is really to try to end this war sooner rather than later?
No, it's just, in my opinion, it's just the opposite. That decision to release the Abrams tanks into Ukraine was as much a political decision as a military decision, because it was the decision that unlocked the Germans to allowing the Leopard tanks to go in to Ukraine. So it was a political decision as well. It was also a political decision to show Putin that the West, beginning with the United States, but all of the West, the NATO nations, were not going to allow the Ukrainians to be without heavy artillery.
But what is the end game? Because if the US and NATO's goal is to bring about a full Russian military retreat, not to say defeat, then one would assume that air power and missiles would be required, wouldn't they?
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, you would. That's what I said, and I've been saying this, that air power needs to be discussed. It needs to be talked about right now. What can we provide? What are the Ukrainians capable of handling? How many pilots do they have? How long would it take to train those pilots on different aircraft? I mean, we've got different kinds of aircraft for different missions. So, no, I think those discussions have to be had right now. This is the time to be helping the Ukrainians with as much as we can help them with.
But all of this seems to be putting NATO and Russia on a collision course. Are you worried about the risk of direct military confrontation by design or by accident? I mean, how close are we today to that eventuality?
Well, sure. I mean, I think we all are, but that's not our decision. That's Mr. Putin's decision. But at the same time, I don't think the United States and its 29 fellow NATO nations should be in a position, if we learn anything from World War II, to say, well, we're so concerned about what might happen that we're just not going to help the Ukrainians as much as they need the help.
As someone who was against the military surge, I recall, in Afghanistan, I wonder to what extent you think, as a former Secretary of Defense, that the West is miscalculating by arming Ukraine the way it has, by essentially throwing in all these weapons with all the extraordinary risks that it entails, not just for Ukraine, but for the rest of the world. I spoke with Secretary Esper last week and asked him if it was a risk worth taking with two nuclear powers, the US and Russia. He said, well, yes, it is, because we're defending freedom. Do you agree?
I mean, we don't have any choice here. This isn't a matter of choice. We have no choice here. What Putin has started, as I said before in this interview, we haven't seen this since the end of World War II. If we allow this to happen, if we allow Putin to be successful, it won't stop with Ukraine. It will send a very clear message to any tyrant in the world, whether it's Xi, the North Koreans, the Iranians, and it will send a very clear message that the West is not willing to do what it must do to stick up, stand up for freedom. And that's a very critical component of who we are as people, as citizens of the future of mankind, the future of the world.
But nuclear brinkmanship means that we all inch closer and closer to the possible use of a nuclear weapon. So let me ask again, do you believe that it's a risk worth taking?
Well, of course it's a risk. I mean, war is not without risk.
But should this risk be taken? Not only a possible nuclear exchange, but there could be an accident at a nuclear plant in Ukraine. That's also a possible scenario.
That's exactly right. There are risks in everything. But you have to weigh the risk with the consequences of the outcome of this particular war. You want the consequences of the outcome here, not for us to support Ukraine enough so that the Russians take control of Ukraine, send a very clear signal that aggression does work in the 21st century. We're right back to where we were in the 1930s and the 1940s, and here we go again. And the consequences of this will be very severe. And so I think President Biden, I think the West is handling this exactly right. I think they're handling it responsibly. They're doing everything they can, even though I think some of it's a little late in helping the Ukrainians. But no, it's all critical. There are mistakes in war. There's nothing perfect with war. There are mistakes all the time in war, in miscalculations. I think Mr. Putin has made 3 basic miscalculations, and I mentioned them to you here a few minutes ago. But again, the consequences of where this will go, if Ukraine loses and the Russians win, will be very significant. And I would add one other thing. We'll be fighting another war, but this time it won't be just Ukraine. It will be in other parts of the world as well as Europe. And that's what you've got to look at, and you have to weigh it all. But there are risks. Of course, there are risks.
But so again, Secretary Hagel, how does this conflict end? Do you think Presidents Biden and Putin should sit down and talk? Is there wisdom to that? Is there any foresight for some kind of a grand bargain, a new Yalta of sorts?
Well, this is not comparable to Yalta at all. But as to the two of them, Putin and Biden sitting down to talk, maybe down the road, possibility. I wouldn't rule anything out diplomatically, but that cannot be done. And as President Biden has said, without President Zelensky being also at the table. I mean, mistakes that we've made in the past, whether it was ending the Vietnam War the way we did, or the Afghan War the way we did. What we did is we left the country, Vietnam, Afghanistan, their governments out of the negotiations. We can't do that, should not do that. Biden said we will not do that.
All right, former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, it's been a great pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you.
The U.S. Defense Department announced in early January $3 billion in additional security assistance to Ukraine. In less than a year, the U.S. committed over $105 billion to Ukraine, mainly for military assistance. Russia, whose military budget for 2021 was $66 billion, has warned of the consequences of providing Ukraine with more weapons. So how would additional U.S. and Western weapons affect the conflict? Are we closer to a direct military confrontation between NATO and Russia? Joining me now to discuss this is George Beebe, Director of Grand Strategy at the Quincy Institute. He is former director of the CIA's Russia Analysis and author of the book, The Russia Trap: How Our Shadow War with Russia Could Spiral into Nuclear Catastrophe. George Beebe, was the decision by the United States and Germany to reverse course and supply tanks to Ukraine after refusing to do so for months driven primarily by military strategic factors or by political considerations in order to avoid a rift within the NATO alliance?
Well, I think a little bit of both those factors were important, but on balance, I think this is more of a political decision than it was a military decision. Now, why do I say that? There was, within the alliance, a growing dispute, primarily between Germany on the one hand and Poland and the Baltic states on the other, over providing Ukraine with everything it needs on the battlefield, essentially to drive the Russians off of all Ukrainian territory. And the Germans needed some reassurance that they were not going to be singled out as the problem here. And the U.S. decision to provide the Abrams, I think, enabled the Germans to move forward with the decision to provide the Leopard tanks to Ukraine.
And so can it change fundamentally the course of the war? I ask this because it's been heralded here in the US and in the West in general as a move that could turn the tide of this war. But we're only talking about 31 Abrams tanks, a few dozen German Leopard 2s. So let's say all in all 100, possibly even 150 new battle tanks, even if they're properly deployed and integrated within Ukraine's defense systems. What difference would they make? Could they change the momentum for a bit, but could they fundamentally change the war in any way?
Well, to put this in perspective, at the beginning of the war, the Ukrainians had more than 2,000 tanks, Soviet-manufactured tanks in their arsenal, and the Russians had many thousands more. And in this battle, both sides are going through tanks at an enormous rate. And I think it's fair to say that a few hundred tanks aren't going to change the war fundamentally, even if the Ukrainians are fully trained on them, which is going to take quite some time. That doesn't happen instantly.
And they won't arrive soon enough.
And they won't arrive very quickly. And in the meantime, I think the Russians are going to be moving forward with some sort of major offensive. And these tanks probably won't make a difference there. Now, off in the future, could they help with some sort of counterattack? Could they, in concentrated form, help the Ukrainians break through at a select area where the Ukrainians perceive a Russian weakness? Sure, I think that's possible. Will that ultimately swing the entire war Ukraine's way? I rather doubt it.
The US, NATO, and Russia, for that matter, keep talking about how to, quote unquote, win the war, but few are talking about how to end this war. With this latest move, are we potentially inching closer to a military confrontation between the US and NATO and Russia? Both Moscow and Washington seem eager to avoid this, but can they?
Well, I hope they can, but I think there's no question that this war is escalating step by step, incrementally. And the more it escalates, the more difficult it is going to be to avoid a direct military confrontation between Russia and the West.
And that, doesn't it, it does increase exponentially the risk of nuclear war, either by design or by accident.
Well, I think that's correct. Once you're talking about a direct military clash between Russia and NATO, it becomes very difficult to prevent this from escalating to the nuclear level, particularly in the context of no trust, really, between the sides, very little ability to talk with one another, and a belief on both sides that their existence is at stake here. Those are very high stakes, and the ability to manage that kind of situation, I think, is quite limited. So it's a dangerous situation.
But so where and how does this war end? Is it a question that Western policymakers, American policymakers should be asking themselves before pouring more and more weapons into this conflict?
Well, I think absolutely they should.
Are they?
Well, I think they're starting to. The problem here is not that they don't want to figure out the way out of this war. The problem is it's not an easy question to answer. The Russians want this war to be a war of attrition. They believe that they can, over time, wear down the Ukrainians, use up their men, use up their munitions, and exhaust the West's political will. And I think we realize that time may in fact be on the Russian side. So what are we trying to do in response? We're trying to turn this into a war of maneuver, where the Ukrainians can use high technology and intelligence and precision weaponry to break through the Russian lines.
But what is the end game, though, for the United States? Is it the sovereignty of Ukraine, or is it the weakening of Russia?
Well, I'm not sure we've answered that question for ourselves. And it's one that we have to, I think, earnestly consider, because what's at stake here is not just where Ukraine's territorial borders are going to be drawn. What's at stake here is broader stability in the world and a potential nuclear confrontation between the world's two largest nuclear powers. And I think we're going to have to ask ourselves, how do we avoid Armageddon here in a way that does not sacrifice Ukraine's independence and sovereignty?
Is the West, is NATO literally playing Russian roulette by risking this wider confrontation that you talk about? The NATO Secretary General says the war ends with the withdrawal of Russia from all Ukrainian territory. But can Russia be defeated militarily?
Well, I don't think so. I think if push comes to shove and Russia believes that its hold on Crimea is threatened, Crimea, which has so much historical and emotional resonance for Russia, but also is host to the Black Sea Fleet, without which the maritime routes into Russia's southern periphery are exposed. I think Russia draws the line there, and it will escalate in order to prevent the loss of Crimea. And I don't think that escalation will immediately jump to the use of nuclear weapons, but it could kick off a spiral that winds up there. So I think it's a very dangerous situation.
And so in terms of how this ends, you know Russia extremely well. You said recently that the US has to discuss with the Russians Ukraine's military relationship with the West, which, quote, is why this war happened in the first place. Do some in Washington, do some on Capitol Hill, even in the White House, share those views?
Well, I think some do, but that is a controversial perspective here in Washington. There are many people that think that this war is pure and simple an example of Russian imperialism, an attempt to rebuild the Soviet Union, rebuild the Russian Empire, and that the only thing one can do under those circumstances is to fight back and ensure that Russia does not succeed. But I think there's another important aspect of this war that has been building for almost 3 decades, which is the broader European security order, Russia's place in it, and Ukraine's relationship to NATO and to the United States militarily. And the Russians have long sounded the alarms on this and said that having Ukraine become a military ally of the United States, either officially or unofficially, constitutes a military threat that Russia cannot live with.
I know you don't have a crystal ball, but will the conflict be resolved through war ultimately, or will it have to be through diplomatic means?
I don't think this war can be won on the battlefield by any sides. And I think both sides have miscalculated greatly. It's clear that the Russians did not expect the kind of Ukrainian resistance that they encountered, and they did not expect the degree of Western military support to Ukraine that has followed the invasion. And I think the United States did not anticipate that the Russians would proceed with an invasion when faced with such onerous economic sanctions and such a strong, united Western response to this. So I think both sides have miscalculated. And I think right now it's clear that neither side can actually win. The Ukrainians can't win because they're facing the world's largest nuclear power. And I think if push comes to shove, the Russians have a lot of escalatory potential to prevent a Ukrainian unconditional victory. By the same token, I don't think the Russians can win on the battlefield either because of the West's support to Ukraine and Ukraine's courage and resolve in fighting back. So if this war is going to end, I think it's going to have to end in some sort of diplomatic agreement, as hard as that will be. And it will be very hard to forge one, but I think the alternatives are much worse.
George Beebe, great having you on the program. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing your unique insights and perspectives.
My pleasure. Thank you.
As the war in Ukraine enters its second year, both sides, however defined, have adopted an increasingly dangerous escalatory mode. While a nightmarish war rages on, they boast and daydream of military victory. And while many talk of winning the war, few discuss ways of ending it. Washington's U-turn and decision to send 31 Abrams tanks to Kiev is hard to grasp tactically. 31 or 100 main battle tanks could win a few battles, but not the war. Strategically, though, it increases the risk of a Russia-NATO confrontation, which both Moscow and Washington seem eager to avoid. But will they? Because after tanks, what comes next? And so, in short, the current leitmotif of NATO, cheering on the arming of Ukraine until Russia's defeat, is a dangerous place to be. Ultimately, this can only lead to nuclear brinkmanship. So dangerous, so catastrophic, so absurd that we all try not to contemplate it, even when it's knocking at the door. And so it may be high time for some diplomatic heavy lifting to try to find a way out of this war. From me, Ghida, Fakhry, and the entire team here in Washington, thanks for watching.